you have any questions during her presentation, feel free to put them into chat or raise your hand, and I'll make sure that Sherry gets them.
All right. Good morning, everybody. We're going to talk today about strategic communication, what it means in business. So before we start, the first thing that we should look at is a definition. You go to the dictionary and it gives a very simple sentence: the imparting or exchanging of information or news. It's a simple sentence, but think about what a punch that sentence gives. Who is imparting the information? Where are we exchanging that information? How are we exchanging that information? The who, the what, the when, the why is all wrapped into that one little sentence. And like I said, simple sentence, but gives one heck of a punch. So, as I said, today we're going to talk about business communication. And business communication generally falls into two categories: verbal and nonverbal. So let's go back in America's history, back to the days of the pioneers. Think about this. Yesterday, Kelly talked about having a Possumville as a town. Well, think this. If I am living on my farm, and it is long before the days of Ubers and Lyfts and planes and trains, how did people get around? Horseback, or we walked, right? So if I'm sitting on my farm and I want to go visit Kelly in Possumville, there's probably a path or a road to get to her town. But Amanda has built the Healy Tavern in between Possumville and my farm. And boy, oh boy, it's a long ride. So I definitely want to stop at the tavern. But Amanda doesn't have a path or a road. So what did she do? Well, there's a saying called blazing a trail. And it came from people who rode horseback and people who have horses. And on the front of their face, sometimes you will find a big white mark. It's called a blaze. So people who were pioneers and settlers would take their axe or their knife, and we can all see Amanda doing this, and cutting into a tree at eye level, a blaze. And she would do that about every 50 feet or so to what? Mark a path. It was a nonverbal, simple communication that was direct. It got me from my farm to her tavern. So think about that, because here we are 3 centuries later, and that's still a phrase we use, at least in the South where I'm from. So communication has always been verbal, nonverbal. Now, fast forward into technology, and let's think about the telegraph. Think about all the infrastructure. I'm going to throw in a lot of community development words. Think about all of the infrastructure that had to go in to creating the telegraph. Well, we put lines in and poles, and we created telegraph offices. Why? Because Stuart down in Abington had 100 head of cattle to sell. And he was going to sell them to Elizabeth, who is retired and out in Montana, right? So 2 types of business communication went on. One, a longhand, and by that I mean cursive, letter went out with all of the details. I have 100 head of cattle. They're going to be fattened up by September. I'm going to put them on a train and send them to you, right? That went in a letter. That was part of the business communication. But the second part of that, once the telegraph was invented, was Stuart would go into his telegraph office and send a message. Now, they had to pay by word. So it was very quick, concise. 100 on the way today. And that message went out. So Elizabeth knew 100 head of cattle got on the train today. So that worked again very well. It was verbal communication because they couldn't meet face to face, but it worked. Now we're going to fast forward again to the switchboard and the phones. My grandmother was a switchboard operator in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, when it was a closed city during the war. My grandmother's job, I was there as a little girl, giant switchboard, hundreds of holes that the phones went into with no names because it was all secret. And she had to learn that 15 over and 4 down was the lab that could blow up the world. And think about a miscommunication. If she plugged the wrong plug into the wrong one when someone was having an emergency. So again, she was a bridge, and we're going to talk about bridging a lot. She was a bridge between two offices that could have been critical. And that's how important communication is. There's bits and pieces all along the way. Now we'll fast forward again and think about where we've been in the last 50 years. Well, we've gone to conference lines in offices. We had IBM personal computers in banks when computers were first coming out. We had fax machines and phones and internet and texting and now social media. So in the blink of an eye, our technology has advanced substantially, and sometimes our workforce is struggling to keep up with all the advances and still communicate correctly and not make mistakes. So what we're looking for is a workforce that still communicates, that still gets their point across. And how are we going to do that? Well, we've got to get them down the path, right? And to get them down the path, we have to recognize what our workforce is today. Very interesting. Our workforce is the first in U.S. history to have 5 generations still actively working. And we're going to go in depth on some of these generations. We're going to start with the silent generation. The youngest of the silent generation is 77 years old. And I know in our workforce, there are still plenty of 77-plus-year-old people working full-time. Why did we call them the silent generation? Well, they lived through the Depression. They lived through World War II. And they learned to suffer in silence. They were stoic. My father is that generation. I could talk hours about how stoic and stubborn he is. But in their days of doing business, you looked them in the eye, you shook their hand, and a lot of times a handshake was the deal. People took you at your word. So going from that generation to a baby boomer. My husband is a baby boomer. I missed it by a year, and I remind him of that often. So my husband's a baby boomer. They came around, and during that generation, at least when they were in the workforce and are in the workforce, the internet came out, but it was mainly email. All of the AOL. I remember when my husband conquered AOL and thought it was great. Now, to do AOL dial-up back then, you could turn on your computer, go make yourself a bowl of soup, let your dog out, probably run to the restroom, and it may or may not have loaded by the time you got back, right? And to send an email was a complete change in the business world because you didn't have to write a letter. You didn't have to get on the phone with them. It could be, yes, bag phones, Elizabeth, absolutely. It could be more impersonal because you could fire off an email. My generation is Generation X. I came about, and that generation is actually known as the bridge generation. Why? Because we have parents in the silent generation, and we have children in the millennial or the Gen Z generation. And because of that, we have to bridge that difference. And I'm going to give you an example. When my daughter graduated high school, my father sent her a card. And in the card, Panini generation, that's right, Janet, absolutely. We are squeezed. But my father sent her a card, and in it, he wrote her a letter in cursive. They stopped teaching cursive before my daughter even entered elementary school. She couldn't read the letter. So the bridge had to sit down and read a 3-page letter to my daughter that was very personal. But again, that's his style of communication versus my daughter's style of communication. So think about how that translates in the workplace, right? What does that look like? Well, let's talk about deals I work with all the time, real estate. I work with the ARS program. And, everybody thinks, oh, acquire, renovate, sell. 3 things. No. When you go to acquire property and you're a grantee, very true, Elizabeth. But when you go to acquire the property and you're the grantee, you have to decide in your office who's going to find the property, who's going to get in their car and go look at the property. Well, those are communications, and usually in an office they're verbal, but layer the fact that we have the pandemic going on. So a lot of us are still working remotely. And layer on top of that the different ways that the different generations communicate. So maybe an email works, maybe a phone call works. So what types of things go on and have that? So you figured out who's going to find the property. Now, yes, you have a question?
So Izzy Brown has a question.
Izzy. You're on mute, Izzy. Okay. So, thinking about who's going to go see the property. Is there a real estate agent involved? Is it a bank-owned property? Is it a town-owned property? All of those are communications. How are you going to communicate with that person? Is it something you do in person? Is it something you do in writing? Is it a text? Is it an email? Now you're under contract. And oh, by the way, a contract is a form of communication. You're under contract to purchase the property. You have to get a title company to close it. Oh, there's another link to the communication. You have to communicate to that title company. We're closing on this date. It's going to cost us this much money. And what's going to occur? At closing, money has to be wired. There's another line of communication. Who's bringing the money to the table? The title company then has to communicate with the county because they have to go record that deed. The county, in turn, records it and has to communicate back to the title company and the owner a copy of the recorded deed. Now you're in renovation. In renovation, you have to do a bid package. Well, that's a communication. You have to do a scope of work with your rehab specialist. That's communication. Who is he reporting to, or she? How are they reporting? Is it something where they're great and tech savvy and they can do it on their tablet and send it in because it's a software form? Are they handwriting it? I will tell you, one of the first rehab specialist workups that I received, and it is no one in this conference because they are no longer doing it, gave it to me on a napkin in a diner, written out on a napkin. And it started off with a declining balance. And it said, NSP, 45,000. Subtracted 15,000 out for a kitchen, 5,000 out for a roof, and then said, other to be determined. Well, he communicated, but I had no idea what he was going to do. So think about all of those little things that occur. Let's talk about the selling phase, the S of my program. Is it something that a housing counselor maybe already has a pipeline of buyers ready? So now the housing counselor is having to communicate with the rehab specialist. Hey, how far is it? Send me a picture of the kitchen. The home buyer wants to see it. The housing counselor is also the bridge to the lender, getting that client to the lender. Now the housing counselor is communicating with the rehab specialist is communicating with the grant manager, and all paths lead to DHCD because we get to hear all of it. The family gets ready to purchase. Sometimes the housing counselor goes to the closing with them if they're nervous. Sometimes the grant manager will go to the closing if there's an issue. The house is sold. So lots of moving parts, lots of different links. And if one goes wrong, where are we, right? What's going to happen? Well, the deal could fall apart. And to give you an idea about that, Notre Dame did a study of Fortune 500 companies, and it's absolutely terrifying. They did the study on communication and found, on average, Fortune 500 companies spend $63 million a year fixing miscommunication errors. Absolutely terrifying. And they went into detail and they said it could be something as simple as the package got shipped to the wrong address and that family decided to keep it, so they have to reship something. It could be an invoice that was sent to the wrong person and lost. It could be billable hours. So now you're paying staff overtime, weekends, new staff to come in and fix an issue, all because that communication line was broken somewhere along the way. Not that it was ever intentional, and that's what the article talked about. It was not intentional. These are things that occur because people don't think about communication. So again, $63 million annually where they have to go back in and fix communication errors. That would break us as a state. It would absolutely break us. So, how do we get down that path? I think it's so important to realize, one, again, we have 5 working generations in our workforce, and to be very cognizant of the fact as who you're talking to and what is the best way that they will respond or answer your questions and get back to you and hear what you're trying to say. So I would say this. If I had a grant manager who said, my contractor's not listening to me, they're not replying back, well, let's take a look at who we're working with. If you have a baby boomer and 2 Gen Zs on your job site, then maybe 2 forms of communication closes that loop. So maybe you send a text to all 3 of them, recognizing that only the 2 Gen Zs are going to respond back in a text. And then follow up with an email to all 3, knowing that the baby boomer is probably the only one that's going to respond back to the email. But you've covered all the bases, you've closed your loops, and guess what? You are now the bridge making that communication work and not costing $63 million in miscommunications. So the last thing that I want to leave you with is this. Lewis Allen was a business scholar. Back in the 50s, he worked with several big, large companies to include Ford, aerospace issues, and even some of the Union Carbides in Oak Ridge. And he went to each one of them and asked a question. He said, it's a simple enough question. Define manager. And he got 5 different answers, not even close to one another. And some of them said, well, a manager does what a manager does. They manage people. Yes, Elizabeth, I will absolutely post something for that. So he looked at what that manager is, what it does. And some people just said, well, if you're a manager, you know what to do. You manage people, you manage things, you manage services. And he said, well, if our companies can't communicate enough to tell a manager what their job is, how is that manager supposed to go out externally and build those relationships and buy those widgets and sell those services, right? So I will leave you with this. We started with a very simple definition of communication. He took this communication and he expanded on it. Lewis Allen said, communication is a bridge. It includes a systematic and continuous process of speaking, listening, and understanding. And that is what is so critical in business communication today. So, any questions?
Sherry, this is Vaughn. I've got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Given the new amount of technologies, communication technologies that we have today, right now, all the hip kids are on TikTok. And thinking about how do we do outreach, both to our clients and to our finding contractors and such. Have you all thought about how to shift and how we can broaden out our tools that you all would encourage us using? Because I know, as Amanda pointed out earlier, it's key to document. So one of the things you said earlier in the workshop was that even if you're putting stuff on your website, you need to see how many people actually looked at the website to see whether or not it was useful or not. The thing with newspapers, we still have a printed, twice a week printed newspaper locally, but most people use an alternative online newspaper. So how are you all thinking about those things?
I was gonna say, I'm gonna let Amanda take this one.
So, that is a great question. It's a great observation, and it's one that we could talk about for a really long time. So, a lot of the regulations that we must comply with still reference communication, publication, putting things in newspapers. Until those regulations change, we're not going to be able to get away from that. As much as we would like to, right? I mean, I have kind of a hit or miss relationship with newspapers. They come into my house occasionally, and it's not uncommon for me to pick them up out of the driveway, walk through the house, and drop them in the recycling bin. So I totally get the issue of newspapers. Until the regs change, we're stuck with that. But let's probe a little bit more. What is the purpose? The purpose of those publications is communication. And so I would encourage everyone to think about not either or. We don't have that flexibility yet. How about instead we do yes and? So the newspaper checks the box. It checks the regulatory box. But if what you really want to do is get public input, what you really want to do is get the opinions of the people that we're trying to serve, we need to use that yes and method. So how do we reach our target audiences? You know, we might want to put flyers up on polls. We might want to go through local civic and faith organizations. We might, in fact, put it on our organizational website and do an e-blast, and you know, the list can go on and on. One of the things that you'll hear us talk about from time to time is the necessity to have 2 public hearings in advance of submission of an application for funding. Well, you know, it's easy to check the box, but my experience is that those public hearings are not necessarily the most effective way to get people's input. If you want a project that is going to, in fact, serve the people that you want it to serve, you have to get their input well before 3 days before the application comes into the agency. And so be creative. In fact, meet people where they are insofar as possible. Check the box, do the publication in the newspaper, but know that that's really just the floor. That's the minimum, that's the floor. And the question then is, how do you do more? And we will continue to raise the issue within our agency and with our funders and so forth, that newspapers don't really cut it anymore. It's not the best way to engage the public. It's an important conversation, Vaughn. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Sherry, I'm just going to say, somebody made a comment about this quote, and I think it is very comprehensive, and yet I will add to it. So it would be a continuous process of speaking, listening, and understanding, and priming parties for action.
Absolutely. And to give you an idea, he wrote this book in 1958 because he saw communication as a problem in business. And guess what? We still have issues. So, you know, it's just amazing that, you know, it continues to be an issue. But I think as this grant management workshop, you know, we're looking for that path forward. And I think that this is one way that we can work on that. All right, if there are no other questions, we are going to take a break.
We did